Shouting is never the first step. That's why situations like this are so frightening. The actual fracture doesn't happen overnight. The door is not kicked down by it. Silently, it enters the room, sits down at the table, folds its hands, and waits. And the atmosphere shifts when everyone senses it, but no one wants to identify it. Even stillness begins to seem loud at that point. This was just how it felt. Something had already broken in the room before a single accusation was made, before anyone spoke out, before names were repeated, and before defenses began to pile on top of one another. It was evident in the posture. It was audible during the pauses. It was evident from the fact that no one appeared at ease enough to think this was simply another awkward family discussion. It didn't feel petty. Unlike confrontations on reality TV, where the tension is heightened and the emotions come right on cue, this one didn't feel staged. This felt heavier and older than the actual scenario, as if the argument had begun long before the cameras rolled and had already left wounds on all of the tables. Then Tamar spoke, but not in a chaotic, tearful, or dramatic way that would have shocked the crowd. She spoke as though she had thought about this scene 100 times, controlled, direct, and measured. And for some reason, that increased the force of the blow. Because people tend to ignore those who are emotional. They describe them as impetuous, theatrical, and unstable. However, it lands differently when someone describes a deep hurt while sounding composed. It feels more like a record than a response. It's more like testimony than a meltdown. The room froze because of that. She wasn't merely expressing herself. She was naming what she thought had happened to her. In a vocabulary more terrifying than rage and certainty, she was articulating betrayal. And there was no way for her to force those words back into the shadows once they were said. Because it affected more than just feelings, the charge at the heart of it all was heartbreaking. It affected family loyalty, protection, livelihood, and trust. Tamar wasn't expressing a sense of exclusion. She wasn't claiming to have been misinterpreted. In essence, what she was saying was that forces associated with those who ought to have shielded her were turned against her. A place where love and discussion ought to have flourished had been invaded by that legal compulsion, and everything is altered by that. Due to family disputes, families let each other down. Families can say hurtful things and even pretend for years that the wounds are not as severe as they actually are. However, the disagreement takes on a different form if legal threats enter a family's emotional bloodstream. It becomes more strategic rather than hurtful. It begins to feel like power. The room moves so quickly because of this. No one actually handled the cease and desist as a minor misunderstanding as soon as it was mentioned. One of the most illuminating aspects of the whole conversation is that when something sounds ridiculous, people tend to brush it off. When something is untrue, individuals typically dispute it outright. However, this was not that kind of answer. Rather, the discussion grew hostile, defensive, and fractured. Questions were raised about names. It was unclear who was responsible. The focus was shifted, and that kind of response speaks for itself. It's an emotional story, not necessarily a legal one or evidence of guilt. Definitely, because people's actions during accusations frequently reveal their worst fears. And it wasn't just what Tamar had said that appeared to frighten everyone in that room. It was the next thing she might say. This is the information that viewers keep returning to, not just the charge itself, but also the context surrounding it. Why did it feel like such a little space? Why did each sentence sound like it was navigating a minefield? Why did some names seem to instantaneously increase the temperature? Why did the energy feel more like confinement than disagreement? These are the questions that caused one online altercation to escalate into a much larger one. Because when a family fights in front of the public on video, the behavior matters just as much, if not more, than the words. In addition to listening to what is said, viewers also observe who interrupts, deflects, corrects, protects, grows anxious, and abruptly becomes untouchable. And in this instance, everyone around her appeared to be more concerned with managing the frame than tending to the wound, while the woman was attempting to drive buried suffering into the light. This is the reason why people can't stop thinking about this scene. Even if it was accompanied by accusations, there was a single, very human cry in the center of it all. When I needed you, where were you? Beneath each piercing line, Tamar seemed to be asking exactly that. When a serious incident occurred, where were you? When I felt besieged, where were you? When my identity, my job, and my tranquility were at danger, where were you? When I needed a sister more than a plan, where were you? And legal distancing is not an answer to that kind of question. Technicalities cannot calm it. Semantics cannot heal it. Telling someone to calm down won't stop it. Because when someone says, "Nobody came to my defense," they are conveying more than just what happened. They're talking about being abandoned. One of the hardest traumas in a family is abandonment. Because of this, the scenario was agonizing despite the details, the paperwork, and the public spectacle. It struck a global chord. The fear of discovering that the individuals you believed would defend you might have prioritized distance over defense, order over truth, or image over intimacy. Viewers can identify that worry. The majority of people might never be seated at a family table that is shown on television. The majority might never come under viral scrutiny. The majority of songs never deal with lawyers, public narratives, or the reputations of celebrities. However, many individuals understand what it's like to be the only person in a room speaking the painful truth while everyone else suddenly becomes fixated on phrase, tone, timing, and damage management. That's what made this moment so powerful. It didn't feel like a single woman attempting to prevail in a dispute. It was as if a single woman had decided to stop being silent. And as soon as that quiet broke, the discussion shifted from what had transpired to who had the authority to choose what might be spoken. The whole thing starts to feel eerie at that point, because quiet is rarely empty in families, particularly those defined by fame, wealth, public image, and long-standing unsolved wounds. Being silent can be a sign of loyalty. Fear can be found in silence. Silence can be a sign of tiredness. Being silent can be a form of self-defense. Guilt can be expressed in silence. One tactic is to remain silent. It might be a prison to be silent. And there was so much of it in this moment. Each moment seemed heavy. Each interruption seemed deliberate. The emotional essence seems to be obscured by each explanation. Rather than pausing to inquire, what precisely was sent? The room seemed to tighten around denial without completely denying, around distance without completely disengaging, and around correction without comfort. Rather than asking, "How did this affect you?" or saying, "Show us what happened so we can understand." The internet never leaves a response like that unanswered, due to the fact that audiences in general are pattern seekers. They examine responses in addition to hearing assertions. They look for behavioral and verbal alignment. Additionally, speculation fills the void when they see a discrepancy. This is precisely what took place. 5 doors remained partially closed as the scenario opened. 1. Additionally, people begin formulating hypotheses when they do not receive clarification. They rewind the video. They examine nonverbal cues. They draw comparisons between the present and past interviews, conflicts, public separations, and subtle slights that seemed insignificant at the time but now seem significant in retrospect. A pause from years ago seems significant all of a sudden. A chilly look looks laden. An ancient quiet begins to seem deliberate. A name takes on symbolic meaning, and that's how a personal injury turns into a public uproar. However, sadness continues to be the true emotional core behind all the hypotheses. Because this was about more than just a vacation, filming, branding, and who knew what and when. It was about the real-time collapse of trust. The legal lines weren't the most agonizing. They were the private ones. The constant insistence that nobody stood up for her. The pressure she felt to bring the issue to national television because private accountability had previously failed may have been exacerbated by the notion that someone connected to her own family was involved. Consider how lonely that is. To believe that the public is your only remaining witness. To have the impression that the only object in the room that can't interrupt you is the camera. To believe that everyone but you will shape the version of events that survives if you don't speak it now. That is a very specific kind of desperation, not theatrical or wild desperation, but the desperation of someone who feels as though stillness is engulfing them. Her consistency was important. Because of this, she didn't sound like a guesser. She gave off the impression of someone with a lot of hurt. Someone who had made too many private connections to continue acting as though the image didn't exist. Someone who had had enough of being informed that what seemed violent to her was either overdone, normal, or manageable. Families with a long history of imbalance frequently experience that. When someone says out loud what everyone else has silently decided to avoid, that person becomes the tough one. The person who tells the truth becomes the issue. The emotional person turns into a liability. As if the discomfort started with their words rather than the wound itself, the person who names the fracture is held accountable for creating discomfort in the room. And in this instance, that dynamic was painfully apparent. There was a more profound emotional undertone to even the constant push to specify who she meant. It sounded at first like a request for clarification. However, it also seemed like something different to a lot of spectators. An effort to confine the conflict to a smaller, potentially easier to contain frame, isolate the accusation, and distance the group from the harm. However, Tamar did not appear to be interested in making it smaller because, in her opinion, it was not little. It wasn't a single act. It was a climate, a pattern, a chain, and a general lack of defense. She kept coming back to the same subjects because of this. Not because she was at a loss for words, but rather because tragedy frequently reopens old wounds. When there is no response, hurt keeps happening. When no one opens the door honestly, betrayal comes back. So she said it again. She made a point. She repeatedly drew the line. The message conveyed by each repeat was, "You will not minimize this while I am still in the room." This is both potent and devastating, because, once a conversation reaches that stage, it is nearly hard to resolve the issue at hand. Not because healing is unachievable, but rather because no one at the table is functioning from the same emotional reality as before. Others are speaking out of fear, others from allegiance, some from perplexity, some from harm, some from defense, and yet others from image protection. Furthermore, the reality is instantly rearranged by fear more than anything else. When certain names are mentioned, you can hear it and the room instantly becomes more focused. That particular information was crucial. There are usually names that hold additional weight in family disputes. Names associated with public mythology, history, power, or hierarchy. The dispute becomes more than just a matter of sentiment as soon as one of their names is mentioned. It turns into a question of structure, who is subject to criticism and who is not, and who best embodies not just themselves, but a whole identity that the family is committed to maintaining. The protective reaction did not feel casual, making it one of the scene's most revealing emotional turns. It seemed crucial. It was instinctive. On camera, it seemed like a boundary that no one wanted to cross. And when viewers see a line like that, they begin to wonder why it is so important. Is it because they're innocent? Does that person's power play a role? Is it because the public perception of the family revolves around that individual? Is it because their inclusion in the narrative poses a greater threat than the direct conflict? Is it because naming them might make connections that no one wants to make? These inquiries explain why the scene touched such a nerve, but they don't prove anything. Because people are witnessing boundaries emerge rather than just dispute. Boundaries also reveal the true source of demand. The issue of the address comes next, among the most terrifying moments of the entire exchange. Because the emotional ground disappears from under the talk and it ceases to be abstract whenever someone claims that their personal information was disclosed without consent during a quarrel. It ceases to be procedural. The worst kind of intimacy develops. Vulnerability, exposure, and the sense that your life's barriers have been breached from the inside out. People find it difficult to move over that kind of betrayal. Even if a family dispute is unpleasant, it can still be resolved. However, a new kind of anxiety is created when it is suggested that confidential information passed via trustworthy hands to someone who is thought to be threatened by. It is not insignificant that it states, "Not only was I not protected, I may have been made reachable." Dramatic exaggeration is not what that is. A wounded person does not just forget that. And the emotional stakes go well beyond typical sibling conflict if that possibility enters the room. As a result, many viewers were reacting to more than just celebrity turmoil as they witnessed the scene. They were reacting to the actual texture of betrayal. The sound of someone realizing that the threat may have come from doors opened by individuals closest to them rather than just strangers. That agony is instinctive and instantaneous. Embarrassing because familial betrayal causes confusion in addition to pain. Your whole sense of security is jumbled. It causes you to reflect on all of your past silences, inexplicable distances, and moments that you earlier overlooked because you wanted to maintain your faith in the link. And the past takes on a new form once that process starts. That's another reason why this scene was so powerful. It gave the impression that spectators were witnessing years of suppressed stress explode via a single, tiny aperture, sediment ultimately crumbling under strain, not a haphazard dispute, not a single quarrel. It might have been about a letter. There was much more to the feelings: honesty, loyalty, protection, and recognition. Who is protected? Who is in charge? Who is trusted? To maintain peace, who is sacrificed? These are old family inquiries. This explains why a scenario like this has such a profound impact outside of the realm of celebrity culture. In their own lives, the majority of people have sat at some variation of the table. Perhaps not in a literal sense, perhaps not with cameras, but emotionally. A table where one person tries to ask, "What happened to me matters?" And the room responds, "Can you say it in a way that inconveniences us less?" This is a table where the truth is negotiated based on who can suffer its repercussions, rather than being debated on its content. A table where the initial hurt is not even the most agonizing aspect. It is the awareness that your suffering is being handled like a management problem. This was how it felt. The most unsettling aspect of it all may be the lack of catharsis, a definitive conclusion, a moment of solace, or a reassuring moment when someone sobbed, leaned across the table, and prioritized love above tactics. Rather, the sequence concluded with sharper uncertainty rather than closure, as is sometimes the case with actual family breakups. Nobody came clean. Nobody was completely comforted. Nobody was able to completely dispel the terror. And the loudest thing that remained was that absence. Because when the setting shifts, unresolved pain does not go away. It lingers. It comes next. In the imaginations of all those who witnessed it, it grows. Because it seems like the emotional reality was greater than the obvious facts, it becomes the kind of moment that people return to. The clip continues to exist because of this. Not because it was the loudest altercation ever captured on camera. It captured something more difficult to shake, not because it produced a flawless unveiling. The sensation of seeing a woman appear completely alone in a room full of people who are related to her by blood and celebrity. In what she knew, alone. In her feelings, she was alone. She was the only one who insisted that the incident was serious and that it needed to be documented. And that picture has a dreadful quality. Because loneliness affects people differently when it occurs in public and close to family. When you are surrounded, but still unsupported. When you are seen, but yet unprotected. And when you respond without being heard. That's what gave this moment such enduring emotional impact. It was more than a simple altercation. With witnesses, it was seclusion. And those witnesses were the audience. Perhaps this explains why so many people keep playing it over and over. Because they see a familiar aching beneath the names, the legalese, and the notoriety of it all. The pain of attempting to be honest in a situation where control is paramount. One question is whether all claims are verifiable. On an emotional level, however, one reality could not be overlooked. This woman thought she had been let down, and those in her immediate vicinity were unable to respond to that belief with compassion. They responded to it with containment, red lines, tension, and caution. Additionally, viewers notice when tenderness is absent from a family reckoning because even those who are unaware of the background can sense when compassion ought to have appeared but did not. Ultimately, perhaps that is the most profound reason why this moment seems to include more than a single scene. It goes beyond what was said. It is about what a family looks like when trust has deteriorated to the point where even having a discussion feels risky. When language song sounds like evidence. When names sound like alarms, when truth sounds pricey, when safeguarding the brand appears easier than protecting the bond, when a sister has to employ a camera as a witness because private loyalty no longer feels dependable. That goes beyond drama. That's real-time grief. Sadness for the family's former state. Sadness for what ought to have been trust. Sorrow about the potential that some cracks become so well known because they were neglected in private for too long. Because of this, the last emotion this scene evokes is not victory. It's melancholy, deep sadness. Seeing people who are related by blood speak like enemies is depressing. Instead of offering consolation, the anguish of witnessing suffering was addressed with posture. The sorrow of understanding that strangers may not always be the source of a family's worst wound. It is what insiders are unable to prevent.